The shovel bit into the earth before sunrise, before the meadowlarks had roused themselves from the sage, before the sky above Laramie Basin had shifted from black to the gray blue of old tin. Ren Calloway worked in the half-dark with the practiced economy of someone who had learned long ago that motion was cheaper than thought. The cabin floor had been pulled back in sections, rough-cut planks she'd numbered with charcoal, so they'd go down again in the same order. And the hole beneath was already chest-deep, already smelling of cold clay and old roots, and something mineral and permanent that she associated with the word underneath: July. The thermometer nailed to the porch post would read 33 degrees by mid-morning. The sweat running down her spine didn't care about the calendar. She was 34 years old. Her hair, the dark brown of creek water, after rain, was pinned back so tight against her skull it pulled at her temples, and she'd stopped noticing that months ago. Her eyes, when she paused to gauge the depth of the hole, were the color of slate, not the soft gray of overcast sky, but the hard gray of stone that has been split and shows its true face for the first time. Her hands on the shovel handle carried the specific history of the past 18 months written in callus and scar. The enlarged knuckles from cold winters past the palms ridged where tools press longest, the particular roughness that accumulates when a person has been doing the work of two people for longer than any person should have to. She did not look at her hands much. They were tools, not subjects. She did not think of herself as preparing for disaster. She thought of herself as doing arithmetic. The arithmetic had begun on an evening in late May, 6 weeks after the ground thawed enough to bury Daniel, when she'd sat at the table with the lamp turned low and a sheet of paper she'd been saving since the previous autumn. She wrote numbers the way other women her age wrote letters, carefully, with awareness of each mark. Wyoming Territory documented winters ran from 4 months on the mild end to 7 on the killing end. One adult woman performing moderate to heavy labor required at minimum 1,800 calories per day to maintain function. Below that threshold, the body began to consume itself in a specific and predictable order. Fat first, then muscle, then the organs began their quiet negotiations with survival. She knew this not from any medical text, but from what her body had done to her in February when the flour bag stood empty for 4 days, and she'd felt her own thinking go slow and strange around the edges, like ice forming on still water. She had written the number on the paper: 340 kilograms. 7 months. She'd looked at it for a long time. Then she'd stood up, taken the paper to the wall beside the window that faced north, and pinned it there with a tack she pulled from the doorframe. It would stay there until she'd done what it said. The hole needed to reach 2.5 meters. She was at 1 3/4. She climbed out, moved a bucket of clay to the edge of the porch, climbed back in. A meadowlark called from somewhere in the sage. Another answered from farther away. The light came up slow and even across the basin, and the mountains to the west went from black shapes to purple shapes to the specific green-gray of pine forests on limestone, and Wren kept digging. She had been in this basin since 1879. She'd come with Daniel at 27, young enough to believe that hardship was a temporary condition that preceded prosperity, old enough to have seen her father's farm in Western Virginia fail twice and recover once, which she thought was a reasonable sample size for how the world worked. Daniel Calloway had been a man of extraordinary physical optimism, not the shallow optimism of someone who hadn't suffered, but the deeper, stranger kind that persists despite evidence, that looks at a failed crop and sees a lesson rather than a verdict. She had loved him for it. She had also, when she was being honest with herself in those long, quiet hours before dawn, been afraid of it. He had died on February 23, 1886. 4 months ago now, 4 months and some days, though she had stopped counting the days sometime in April, when counting them had begun to feel less like grief and more like a habit she couldn't break. The morning he left, the sky had been the particular white of snowlight, flat and directionless, the kind of sky that gave no information about where the sun was. She'd watched him check the buckles on his coat, a gesture so familiar she could reconstruct it from memory with the precision of a daguerreotype, and she'd said, "The barometer dropped 6 points since yesterday. The clouds are wrong. Don't go." He'd looked at the sky himself, that same sky, and seen something different in it. His chest rose with the breath of a man who had already decided. "I'll be back before dark," he told her. "We're down to the last of the flour. I'll be back before dark." He kissed her forehead. He took the rifle. He stepped off the porch into the snow that was ankle-deep and passable, and entirely deceiving. The blizzard arrived 2 hours later with the speed of something that had been waiting. She did not learn until later, much later, that he had gotten within 3 kilometers of the cabin on his way back. That he had found a deer shot, it cleanly begun the return journey with the carcass across his shoulders. That the distance between where he fell and where she was sitting watching the white wall of wind move across the basin was a distance a person could walk in 40 minutes on a clear day. She found him on the 15th of March when the snow had retreated enough to show what it had been hiding. His hand still held the rifle. His face was turned slightly toward home. She had stood there in the melting snow for a long time, not moving, not making any sound, just standing with the knowledge that the gap between living and not living was sometimes exactly that. Narrow, exactly that, arbitrary, exactly that, contingent on a barometric reading that one person had taken seriously and another had not. She lost the child 11 days later. She had been 6 months along. The doctor in Granger Falls, when she finally made the trip in April, said these things sometimes happened under stress, that her body had made a decision the way bodies make decisions below the level of consent. She had nodded at him. She had driven the wagon back to the cabin alone. She had not been back to town since, except to buy supplies, and she had not spoken to anyone about either loss, except in the most transactional terms the situation required. What she had not told the doctor, what she had not told anyone, was the detail that returned to her most often in the dark hours before dawn. She had known the barometer was dropping. She had read it herself that morning, watched the needle move in the direction that meant danger, said so out loud to a man who loved her and did not listen. She was not a woman who indulged self-blame as a practice. Blame required energy she didn't have and produced nothing she could use. But the fact of it sat in her like a splinter too deep to reach. She had been right, she had said so, and the saying had not been enough. The arithmetic started the first evening she was able to eat a full meal without her hands shaking. That was late May. She gave herself from late May until the end of September. 4 months to undo 4 months of unpreparedness, plus enough additional margin that she would never again be in a position to watch a barometric reading go unheeded while someone she loved walked into a blizzard with a flour bag running empty behind them. The hole was 2.5 meters now. She climbed out, set down the shovel, looked at what she'd made. The clay walls were smooth where the shovel had cut them, and rough where she'd had to use the pick. At the bottom, the temperature was already noticeably cooler than the morning air, above a difference of perhaps 8 degrees, which was exactly what she needed. She'd read about root cellars in a farming almanac, she'd traded a jar of preserves for the previous autumn, and she'd read about them again in a government pamphlet on homestead food storage that the post office in Granger Falls had been distributing since 1883. The principle was straightforward. Below a certain depth, in the Wyoming clay, the temperature stabilized, holding between 4 and 13 degrees Celsius, regardless of what the air above was doing. Things stored at that temperature did not freeze. Things stored at that temperature did not spoil. Things stored at that temperature simply waited unchanged for the moment they were needed. She understood on a level that had nothing to do with almanacs or pamphlets that she was building herself a hedge against the specific kind of loss that had undone her. Not against grief. Grief was its own territory with its own weather, and she had learned to navigate it as one navigates known terrain in poor visibility, slowly, with constant reference to landmarks. What she was building was a hedge against the material conditions that turned survivable hardship into unsurvivable hardship. She was building it with a shovel and 4 months of Wyoming summer and every dollar she could pull from the work her hands were capable of doing. She began lining the walls that afternoon with straw she'd bought from the Henderson farm, then with milled sawdust from the lumber operation 3 miles down the valley road, then with planks of pine she'd cut and fitted herself over 2 days, using a saw that had been Daniel's. The planks went up in layers, each layer trapping air between it and the clay wall, and the air would hold its temperature the way still water holds cold longer than moving water. When she was done with the walls, she did the floor, and when she was done with the floor, she built the trap door from the same pine planks fitted with leather hinges and a recessed iron handle, so it lay flush with the cabin floor when closed and disappeared into the boards like it had always been there. She stood on top of it. It held her weight without flexing. She opened it, climbed down the ladder she'd built, and bolted to the north wall, stood at the bottom in the cold clay dark, and looked up at the rectangle of July light above her. From down here, The cabin was a frame around a piece of sky. From down here, she was exactly as far below the surface as she needed to be. She began the garden the first week of June before the storage pit was finished, because the growing season wouldn't wait for her to finish one project before the next one demanded attention. The plot she broke was 4 times the size of any garden she'd kept, before long rows running east to west to catch the maximum arc of the sun. The soil turned dark and fine with the manure she'd been composting since March. She planted potatoes in the northern third, the heavy-yielding varieties that stored longest, turnips and carrots in the middle section, cabbages along the south edge where they'd get full afternoon sun. Between the rows, she planted dried beans in clusters, and in the narrow strip along the cabin's east wall, she put the herbs she'd need for preservation: dill mustard seed, horseradish root she'd sourced from a farm near the edge of the basin. The 2 boys she hired from the edge of town, 15 and 17 brothers, named Cal and Pete Marsh, whose father had gone east for work and not come back, showed up the first morning with the uncertainty of young men who aren't sure what they've agreed to. She showed them what to do once and paid them on Fridays in cash money, which meant she needed to generate cash money every week to sustain the arrangement. She took in mending from 3 households in Granger Falls, riding in on Tuesdays to collect and Thursdays to return. She taught reading to the 2 youngest Kowalski children on Monday afternoons, working through a primer she'd brought from Western Virginia that had her own childhood pencil marks still faint in the margins. She washed laundry for the hotel on the edge of town on Wednesday mornings, the work that paid best and cost most in terms of what it required from a body already running at capacity. Every dollar went into supplies. She tracked it in the same ledger she used for the farm accounts, a column for income and a column for expenditure. And the expenditure column was dominated line after line by potatoes, turnips, carrots, salt, sugar, lard, dried beans, canning jars, paraffin wax for jar seals, cheesecloth, more salt. She bought from every farm in the basin that had surplus, and she bought in quantities that caused conversation. She knew it caused conversation. She was not unaware of how she appeared to the people watching her move through the summer, a widow woman barely 4 months out buying vegetables by the cartload and digging up her own cabin floor. She had lived in Granger Falls long enough to understand that the community's relationship to visible difference was complicated. They would help you if you were in need, but they were suspicious of anyone who seemed to be preparing for a need they couldn't yet see. Preparation implied expectation of disaster, and expectation of disaster in the logic of the frontier implied a pessimism that sat uncomfortably next to the central myth of the place, which was that things here were getting better, were always getting better, that the railroads and the telegraphs and the cattle barons were evidence of a permanent forward motion that could not be reversed. She did not argue with this logic. She didn't have time. She planted and hoed and harvested and mended and washed and drove the wagon to town and back and kept the numbers straight in the ledger. And in the evenings when the light was going out of the sky and the basin settled into its particular end-of-day quiet, she sat at the table and read whatever she could find about food storage, about cold winters, about the gap between what people thought they were prepared for and what preparation actually required. Aunt Bess arrived on a Thursday in early July, having come up from Cheyenne on the stage, and then convinced a freight driver to bring her the remaining distance to the basin for the price of a pound cake she'd made specifically for the purpose. Wren heard the wagon coming from half a mile off and went out to the porch to watch it come. The woman who climbed down from the freight bed with the driver's reluctant assistance was 78 years old, which meant she had been born before Wyoming was a territory, before the railroad had pushed this far west, before any of this, the basin, the town, the ranches, the particular dream that had brought so many people here had existed in anything but imagination. Her back curved at the shoulders from decades of leaning into work. Her eyes had gone milky at the edges, but the center of them was still sharp, still taking in information and making fast assessments in the way of someone who had survived enough to know that accurate observation was the cheapest form of insurance. She walked into the cabin, looked at the open floor where the planks were stacked to one side, looked at the hole descending into the clay, looked at the number pinned to the north wall. She did not say anything for a long moment. Then she reached into her traveling bag and pulled out a folded piece of paper worn soft at the creases that she'd clearly carried for some time. She unfolded it on the table. It was a list written in a handwriting different from her own block letters, slightly uneven, the handwriting of someone who'd learned to write as an adult. Wren leaned in to read it. The list was what people in Rooks County, Kansas had eaten in the final weeks of the snow winter of 1880 and 1881, when the blizzards had come one behind another from October through the end of March, and the supply wagons had stopped running entirely for 11 weeks. Bess had been living there then, had watched the winter dismantle assumptions one by one, the way a flood dismantles a fence. The list included things that could charitably be called food-dried corn cobs, ground to powder the inner bark of cottonwood trees, boiled to paste leather harness straps, softened in water, and then softened again, and things that could not charitably be called food at all. Bess had not written the list herself. A neighbor woman had written it, and the neighbor woman had not survived to see the thaw. Bess set the paper on the table between them and put her finger on the middle of it. "You pin this next to your number." Her voice carried the flat certainty of someone delivering a conclusion rather than a suggestion. "You look at it every morning before you start work. Every morning." She looked at Wren with that still accurate gaze. "And then you add 20% to your number, because you're not only counting for yourself." Wren looked at the list. She looked at the number on the wall. She did the math without paper. 340 kilograms plus 20% was 408. Call it 400. Her jaw tightened briefly, not in resistance, but in the recalibration of someone adjusting to new data. "I'll need to extend the walls of the pit," she said. "Then extend them." Bess sat down at the table with the solidity of someone whose body has earned its rest and intends to take it. "Sit down. I want to hear exactly what you've done so far and what you haven't done yet." Wren sat, she told her. Bess listened without interrupting, which was one of her most useful qualities. She had the patience of someone who had learned that incomplete information produced worse decisions than delayed decisions. When Wren finished, Bess was quiet for a moment, turning something over in her mind. "The meat," she said finally. "You haven't started the meat. June was the garden, July is the meat. Start tomorrow, not next week." Bess tapped the list. In Rooks County, the families that had smoked meat in January were the families that were still negotiating in March. The families that had only grain were the families that ran out of options. She looked around the cabin at the tools hung on the wall at the drying rack near the window. "You'll need a smokehouse. I have scrap wood behind the shed. Show me after supper." Bess pulled her traveling bag onto her lap and began unpacking it with the orderly efficiency of someone who had packed and unpacked in difficult conditions many times. "You'll also need to talk to whoever has pigs within 10 miles. You want lard and salt pork, both, not just venison. Venison is lean, it'll keep you alive, but it won't keep you warm enough." Wren knew listening to her that Bess had come, not because she was worried about Wren's grief. Bess understood grief as a functional condition, something you move through by moving, not by stopping, but because she was worried about Wren's numbers. The snow winter of 1880 and 1881 had taught Bess something specific, that the people most likely to die were not the weakest or the oldest or the most unlucky, but the ones whose arithmetic had been almost right. Almost right was the most dangerous category. Almost right meant you ran out in week 12 instead of week 6, which was long enough for you to have stopped looking for alternatives. They built the smokehouse in 2 days, Bess directing from a camp stool she'd installed in a patch of shade because her back would not allow sustained standing, Wren doing the construction. It was 8 feet by 6, built from the scrap pine behind the shed and roofed with sod, with a fire pit dug into the floor and a vent at the peak. It was not beautiful. It was entirely functional, which was the only standard either of them applied. The first deer came in the second week of July. Wren had been tracking the herd that used the creek bottom below the cabin's north field for 3 days before she went out early enough to be downwind of where they watered. And she took a young buck at 60 yards with Daniel's rifle, a single shot that the morning air carried up the valley and then swallowed without echo. She dressed it in the field, packed what she could carry to the cabin in a single trip, went back for the rest. The processing took 3 days, cutting the meat into strips of consistent thickness, rubbing them with the salt and pepper cure she'd mixed from a ratio in the almanac, hanging them in the smokehouse over a low fire of green apple wood she'd cut from the abandoned orchard 2 miles down the valley road. The smoke was thick and white and smelled of something between autumn and a kitchen, and it drifted through the basin in a way that caused Cal Marsh to come over from the garden and stand at the smokehouse door and inhale with an expression approaching reverence. She got a second deer in late July, a third in the middle of August. By then, the routine of processing was efficient enough that she could manage it in 2 days instead of 3, which mattered because there was always something else that needed doing. The news that she was buying every available sack of potatoes and every bunch of dried turnips and every head of surplus cabbage within 30 miles reached Granger Falls sometime in late July. By the ordinary mechanism of small community information transfer, one person mentioning it to another at the post office, the mention passing through 2 or 3 more pairs of hands before it arrived at the ear of Owen Tully, who kept the general store and who therefore had a professional interest in who was buying what in what quantities. Tully mentioned it to Roy Pruitt, the county sheriff, with a tone that landed somewhere between amusement and mild concern. Pruitt was a solid man in his early 50s, solid in the physical sense of someone whose job required dealing with the unpredictable, and who had learned to be unmovable by disposition. He registered the information about Wren Calloway the way he registered most information about the basin's inhabitants as data to be filed under the appropriate heading and revisited if it became relevant. He did not at that time consider it relevant. He cataloged it under widows do unusual things in the first year. He was not unsympathetic. He was also not particularly curious. He had other things to occupy him. The story moved as stories do in small places where entertainment is scarce and novelty is a commodity, from Tully's store to the households it served, and from those households to the larger establishments at the edges of town. And it was from one of those establishments, the barber shop, where Charles Hartwell conducted business on the first Saturday of each month while having his whiskers attended to, that it arrived at Kingsley Ranch in the form of a casual remark made by a man who thought nothing of it. Eugenia Hartwell heard it differently than her husband did. Charles received it as one more piece of basin gossip, the kind of thing that circulated constantly and was worth exactly as much attention as it cost, which was none. Eugenia heard it and felt something she could not immediately name, a small, precise discomfort, like a stone in a shoe, too minor to stop for, but impossible to ignore entirely. She sat with this feeling for 2 days before she decided the most efficient way to resolve it was to go see for herself what the widow Calloway was doing, because Eugenia Hartwell was not beneath the Philadelphia upbringing and the imported drapes and the social certainties a stupid woman. She was a woman whose intelligence had never been required to operate without the supporting infrastructure of wealth, which is a different thing from not having it. She came on a Wednesday afternoon in late July. The carriage was the finest in the basin, black lacquered body leather, interior brass fittings that caught the afternoon sun as it came down the valley road. 2 matched bays pulled it, and the driver was a man named Holt, who had been with the Hartwells since Philadelphia. Eugenia sat inside it, straight-backed, wearing a dress of blue silk that had been made in a shop on Chestnut Street and shipped west in a trunk along with 4 others like it, as though she'd understood from the beginning that Kingsley Ranch would require a certain maintenance of standards against the pressure of its environment. Wren heard the carriage before she saw it. She was in the garden, kneeling at the edge of the potato rows, checking the soil moisture with her fingers the way the almanac recommended. She stood up, wiped her hands on her apron, watched the carriage come to a stop in front of the cabin with the particular unhurried precision of expensive equipment driven by someone who takes pride in it. Eugenia descended with the assistance of Holt's hand under her elbow, looked at the cabin, looked at the garden, looked at Wren standing in the dirt in her work clothes, with her hair pulled back and her face open to the afternoon sun. Something moved through Eugenia's expression, too fast and too complex to name, and then resolved into the social register that long practice had made automatic. Mrs. Calloway. Her voice carried the slight flattening of vowels that the Eastern schools gave their graduates as a permanent credential. I've been hearing the most extraordinary things about what you're doing out here. Wren looked at her without speaking. She knew who Eugenia Hartwell was the way everyone in the basin knew the ranch was the largest employer within 30 miles, and its owners occupied the particular position in a frontier community that they'd inherited from Philadelphia. Not royalty precisely, but something the people around them treated like royalty out of a combination of economic dependency and aspirational deference. Wren had never felt either of those things toward anyone. She'd been too poor in Western Virginia to develop aspirational deferences, and she'd been too independent in Wyoming to develop economic ones. I heard you were buying up half the vegetable production of the valley. Eugenia continued with a smile that said clearly this was charming in its eccentricity, and that you were digging some sort of storage cellar beneath your floor for the winter. The pause she left after that last phrase was precisely calibrated to convey the gentle absurdity of preparing for winter in July. Wren's eyes moved from Eugenia's face to the carriage and back. I'm storing food, she said. Winter is 4 months out. 5 months at least before the first real snow. Eugenia's smile did not waver. It was not a cruel smile. That was the thing about it. It was the smile of someone who genuinely believed she was offering a useful perspective. Mrs. Calloway, I understand you've had a very difficult year. Losing your husband the way you did, that kind of loss can affect a person's thinking. Make things seem more threatening than they are. Perhaps instead of spending the summer digging holes, you might consider, my husband died because we didn't have enough food stored. Wren said it the way she would state the depth of the storage pit or the weight of a sack of potatoes as fact as data, without inflection that invited response. He went out in a blizzard because the flour was gone. He was trying to come back. He didn't make it. She looked at Eugenia steadily. That's not complicated thinking. That's arithmetic. Something moved through Eugenia's face. Then the same complex and too fast thing that had moved through it when she first stepped down from the carriage. But this time it was slower, and Wren could track it more precisely. It was the expression of a person who has received information that does not fit the framework they've arrived with, and who is deciding in the moment whether to update the framework or set the information aside. Eugenia set it aside. The infrastructure of her certainties was too substantial to revise on the basis of a conversation in someone else's garden. But she did not set it aside completely. Wren could see that too in the slight hesitation before Eugenia spoke again. The trains run through Laramie now, Eugenia said, and her voice had taken on a quality of patient explanation, the voice of someone who believes they are sharing knowledge rather than dismissing a concern. The telegraph reaches every major town in the territory. Charles has relationships with suppliers in Denver and Chicago both. If there were ever a genuine shortage, and I don't believe there will be, we have resources available to us that weren't available 10 years ago. That's what civilization means, Mrs. Calloway. It means you don't have to dig holes in your floor. Wren looked at her for a moment. If there's a real shortage, she said, civilization is exactly as useful as the last supply wagon that got through. She bent down, picked up her hoe. Come back in March and tell me I was wrong. I'll be glad to hear it. Eugenia left with the smile still in place, which was its own kind of answer. She climbed back into the carriage, said something to Holt, and the match bays pulled the lacquered black body down the valley road until it curved around the stand of cottonwoods and disappeared. What Wren did not know, could not have known, was what happened when Eugenia arrived home. She walked directly to her husband's study, knocked once open the door, and said that perhaps they should consider increasing the ranch's winter food stores. Charles Hartwell looked up from his accounts with the expression of a man interrupted from important work by something that is not important work. He said the current stores were more than adequate, that the Denver supplier had standing agreements that Eugenia shouldn't let a grieving neighbor woman's anxiety become contagious. Eugenia stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she closed the door without argument, which was not the same as agreeing. Wren turned back to the garden. The afternoon light was coming in low now, golden across the tops of the potato plants, and the basin was as beautiful as it had been every evening since she'd come here. The mountains copper lit to the west, the creek line a dark thread through the sage, the sky the particular deep blue that appears above altitude when the air is dry and the sun is going. She did not find it comforting. Beauty and safety were different things, and the basin had taught her the difference with sufficient emphasis that she no longer confused them. That evening, after Bess was asleep in the corner that served as a guest room, Wren sat at the table with the lamp and her ledger. She had extended the walls of the storage pit 2 days earlier, as Bess had recommended, and the new capacity was 360 kilograms, close enough to 400 that she was working toward it. She went through the current inventory: potatoes already stored 80 kilograms, dried beans 22 kilograms, smoked venison from the first 2 deer 31 kilograms, canning jars already processed 48. She added it up. She was at 49% of her target with 6 weeks of prime growing season still available. She thought about what Eugenia Hartwell had said, not as argument, not as something to refute, but as data about how the people around her were thinking. trains, telegraphs, Denver suppliers. She wrote at the bottom of the ledger page in her small, precise script, "If the road is impassable, the train doesn't help. If the telegraph is working, someone still has to get from the telegraph office to your door." She underlined the second sentence. Then she closed the ledger. September came, and with it the elk. She'd been watching the herd for a week, tracking their movement through the upper meadows, with a patience that had been one of the few direct gifts of her difficult year. Grief had stripped away her impatience, along with various other things, and left her with an unusual capacity to wait without anxiety for the right moment. The bull she chose was not the largest in the herd, but the one that presented the cleanest angle and the best light on a windless morning. And she took him at 90 yards with the second cartridge she'd loaded, because Daniel had always told her to load two before you need one. The elk gave her more meat than the 3 deer combined. Processing it took 4 days. She worked from first light to last cutting and salting and hanging, and when she was done, the smokehouse was full, and the air in the basin for a quarter mile in every direction smelled of applewood and cured meat, and something that was, if you had no other word for it, survival. She put up the last of the summer's garden in the final week of September. Carrots packed in sawdust, turnips in layers of damp sand, cabbages in the far corner of the pit on slatted shelves she'd built to allow air circulation. The potatoes went in last 220 kilograms of them in crates she'd made from the same pine as the walls. She lowered each crate down the ladder by rope, set it on the pit floor, climbed back up for the next. It took most of an afternoon. When the last crate was down and she was standing at the top of the ladder, looking at what she'd stored, she felt something that was not exactly relief and not exactly satisfaction, but something in the vicinity of both the feeling of a calculation coming in close to correct. She counted it all one more time by category, with the lamp held low over the pit. Potatoes 220 kilograms, turnips and carrots 60, dried beans 38, smoked venison and elk 81, preserved fruit and vegetables in jars 42, lard and salt pork 29, flour, cornmeal, dried herbs 11, total 481 kilograms. She'd wanted 480, she was 1 kilogram over. She climbed out, closed the trapdoor, replaced the cabin floor planks in their numbered order. She stood on the floor that now concealed everything she'd done since June, everything she'd calculated and purchased and built and cured, everything that Anders Voss had not had enough of, everything that Daniel had gone out into a blizzard to try to find. The floor looked exactly like a floor. Nobody looking at it would know what was underneath. The third week of August had already changed everything she thought she understood about her own plan. She'd been alone in the cabin when she reached the last foot of the storage pit's depth, and the shovel struck something that rang faintly against the metal blade. She cleared around it with the trowel. A tin box sealed with wax at the seam, the wax dried to a brittle yellow. She carried it up into the light. Inside a small notebook, its cover warped from the long burial, its pages swollen and then dried back to a fragile stiffness. The handwriting inside was a man's, cramped and left-leaning, the writing of someone recording something he needed someone else to find. She read it sitting on the edge of the open floor, with her feet hanging over the hole, and the more she read, the more still she became. The notebook belonged to a man named Anders Voss, who had built the original version of this cabin in 1877 and lived in it through the winter of 1878 and into 1879. He had arrived optimistic about Wyoming in the same way most people arrived optimistic about Wyoming, with the same certainty that the particulars of the place would accommodate the particulars of his expectations. The winter of 1878 had not accommodated them. He described it with the flat specificity of someone documenting an emergency for future reference snow beginning in late October, which was early. Temperatures dropping below -20 by the second week of December. Supply roads closed by Christmas and not reopened until late March. He had been, by his own account, adequately prepared for 5 months of winter. He had faced 6.5. The final entries were dated April of 1879. The last page read, "Running out since 3 weeks. Don't think I'll see the thaw." Below that, the handwriting stopped. Wren read the final page twice. She sat with the notebook open in her hands for a long time, looking at the last line, reading it again. He hadn't seen the thaw. Someone had found the cabin empty, or perhaps not empty, in the way they'd hoped, and the property had passed through whatever administrative channel handled abandoned claims, and eventually Daniel had purchased it in 1879 for back taxes. And neither of them had known they were buying a building that already contained this particular record of what happens when the arithmetic is almost right. She climbed back down into the pit. She stood at the bottom in the cold clay dark and looked up through the trapdoor at the rectangle of evening sky. She thought about Voss. She thought about 6.5 months. She revised the number 480 kilograms minimum, and she revised it again before the week was out, settling on 481, which was the number she would carry through the winter like a second heartbeat present in everything she did. She pinned Voss's notebook on the wall next to the number and next to Bess's list. 3 things on the wall now: her arithmetic, the accounting of what people ate before they died, and one man's record of being almost right. She looked at all 3 for a moment. Then she turned to the window. The sky to the north in the late afternoon light of the first day of November was the color she'd been watching for, not the high, clean gray of ordinary overcast, but something lower and heavier, and without the texture of light moving through it. The clouds sat on the mountains like something pressing down. She closed the curtain. She walked to the south wall and opened the ledger to the current page. At the top, she wrote the date, November 3rd, 1886. Below that, she wrote a number, 481. Below that, after a pause, she wrote 4 words, small and precise, in the center of the page. It's coming. Be ready. She closed the ledger. Outside, the first snow began to fall. The number on the wall read 241 on the morning of November 4th, which was the second day of snow. Wren had recalculated overnight 481 kilograms of stored food translated into days at her projected distribution rate, accounting for the portions she expected to give away, came out to 241 days of supply. She wrote it in chalk on the upper left corner of the north wall, where she would see it first thing every morning, where the light from the east window hit it directly at sunrise. Then she made coffee, ate a bowl of oat porridge with a small pour of molasses, recorded both in the ledger under her name, locked the trap door with the iron bar she'd fitted across it, put on her coat, opened the cabin door, stepped onto the porch. The snow was not dramatic. That was the first thing. It was not the theatrical whiteout of the blizzards described in newspapers, not a storm you could point to and name. It was steady, patient, methodical, the kind of snowfall that doesn't announce itself because it doesn't need to, the kind that simply continues. It had already covered the garden rows to a depth of 8 inches, erasing the distinction between the cultivated earth she'd spent the summer shaping and the undifferentiated ground beyond. The smokehouse roof was white. The woodpile she'd stacked against the cabin's east wall was white along its top edge. The mountains were gone, entirely replaced by a uniform gray that gave no information about distance or depth. She went back inside. She changed the number on the wall from 241 to 240. This was how the winter began, not with catastrophe, but with arithmetic. The cold arrived behind the snow in the second week of November, moving down from the north with the deliberateness of something that had been organizing itself above the Canadian border for months before it decided to come south. The thermometer on the porch post dropped from 20 degrees Fahrenheit to 8 in a single night. 3 days later, it was 2 above zero. The creek that ran through the lower field, which had still been showing dark water through the ice in the last days of October, closed over entirely on November 14th, and the sound it made, a deep tectonic settling, like a building shifting on its foundation, carried up to the cabin in the pre-dawn quiet, and woke Wren from sleep with the physical certainty that something had changed. She lay in the dark for a moment, cataloging the sounds, the wind finding the gaps in the cabin's north-facing chinking, the fire settling in the stove, the particular silence that snow makes when it's deep enough to absorb ordinary sound instead of reflecting it. She got up, put wood on the fire, opened the ledger. The number on the wall was 219. She had been in the winter for 22 days. The cattle at Kingsley Ranch had begun dying in the third week of November. She knew this not from any direct observation, but from the sound. On a still night in late November, when the temperature dropped below -15, and the air was so dry it crackled, sound traveled across the basin with an impossible clarity. She heard the cattle the way you hear something you don't want to hear clearly and too late to do anything about it. Not the ordinary sounds of a large herd settling for the night, but something lower, more sustained, a collective distress that began around 2 in the morning and diminished over several hours. Not because the distress ended, but because the sources of it did. She lay awake and listened. She thought about the 80,000 head that Charles Hartwell had been running across his range as of October. She thought about what percentage of them would be alive by Christmas if this was November, and the temperature was already doing this. She thought about Eugenia Hartwell in the silk dress and the word civilization used as a noun that meant I don't have to prepare for things. She wrote in the ledger November 23rd, heard cattle dying from the Hartwell Range, wind from the northwest at altitude, temperature -17, snowing. Then she closed the ledger and told herself to sleep. 6 miles to the east, in a farm that the basin's social geography had rendered effectively invisible, a man named Thomas Alder was also awake, also listening to the same sounds from a different angle. He had been farming his piece of the basin since 1883, alone since his partner returned to Ohio the following year, running hogs instead of cattle because hogs could be confined, because a confined animal could be fed from stored grain rather than from grass buried under 6 feet of snow. He had learned this distinction during the winter of 1882 when he'd lost 2 fingers to frostbite on a supply run. He shouldn't have needed to make a supply run, necessitated by insufficient planning, a lesson he had not required to be taught twice. He lay in his own cabin, listening to the Hartwell cattle die, and thought about his own storage adequate for one man, well organized, properly insulated. Sufficient. He thought about what sufficient meant for one person versus what it might mean for a community. He thought about the smoke he'd seen rising from the Callaway cabin throughout October and November, the particular quality of it sustained regular, the smoke of a system, rather than a fire lit against the cold. He filed this observation under things worth knowing and went back to sleep. By Christmas Eve, the temperature at Laramie Basin had reached -42 Celsius. Wren knew the exact number because she'd borrowed a second thermometer from the Henderson farm in October, calibrated it against the one she already had installed it in the coldest corner of the porch, where it would read true rather than being influenced by the cabin's warmth. She checked it at 4 in the morning because she could not sleep through the sound the forest was making. The pines on the ridge above the cabin were exploding. Not burning, there was no fire, no smoke, no light. Just sound, a deep percussive crack that began somewhere in the trees above the north field, rolled through the dark like a gunshot without echo. Then another, then a third in rapid succession. The sap inside them was freezing, expanding, splitting the wood from the inside out with a force that had nowhere to go but outward. She stood on the porch in her heaviest coat, her breath turning solid in the air, before her face listening to the trees destroy themselves in the dark. It was not a sound she'd heard before. She added it to the growing inventory of things this winter was doing that previous winters had not done. She went back inside. She added 3 logs to the stove instead of her usual 2. She wrote the temperature in the ledger. She did not write anything else because there was nothing else to record that the number didn't already contain. The day after Christmas, Roy Pruitt came. She heard the horse before she heard the knock. A horse moving carefully through deep snow, moves with a particular rhythm, deliberate and weighted, nothing like the quick cadence of warm weather riding. She opened the door before he could knock a second time. Pruitt looked exactly like a man who had been out in -20 cold for 90 minutes. The exposed skin of his face had a peculiar stillness to it, not the redness of ordinary cold, but the waxy immobility of flesh that had been down to its last reserves of warmth. His beard, he'd grown it out in October, as the basin men tended to do when they understood the winter was going to require it was rimed with ice from his own breath. He took his hat off. This small formality, performed at considerable physical cost, given how stiff his fingers were, told her something about what he'd come to say. She stepped back from the door. The warmth of the cabin reached him like something physical, and she watched him absorb it, watched the rigid line of his shoulders shift slightly downward as the heat reached the muscles that had been braced against the cold for the duration of the ride. He sat at the table when she gestured to the chair, wrapped both hands around the mug of coffee she set in front of him, and looked at the north wall, the number, the list, the notebook. He looked at them long enough that she knew he was reading them, not just registering their presence. Then he looked at her. "I have 2 men in the jail," he said. "Blaine Cutter and Ed Marsh. Cutter was arrested in October for rustling, took 2 calves off the Peterson place when times were already getting tight. Marsh got picked up for drunk and disorderly in November." He turned the mug in his hands. "Both charges are legitimate. Both men deserve to sit it out. But I made a mistake I didn't know I was making when I put them in. I made it in October when I thought winter would be ordinary, when the jail's food supply looked like it would last until spring. A pause. It won't. Wren looked at him. She thought about Blaine Cutter, whom she didn't know, who had stolen cattle from the Peterson family. She thought about Ed Marsh Cal's uncle, who had been drinking heavily since his wife left in the spring. She thought about the particular ethical geometry of feeding people who were in legal custody for things they had actually done. "Have they got family?" she asked. "Cutter's got a wife and a boy in town. She's being looked after by her sister's household barely. Marsh is the boy's uncle. You know the Marsh boys. They worked my garden in the summer." Pruitt nodded. Something moved through his expression, not quite relief, but adjacent to it. The expression of a man who had been calculating his options on a long, cold ride and had arrived at her door because the calculation kept coming back to her. "I am not in a position," he said, and here his voice shifted slightly, took on a quality she hadn't heard from him before, a quality that cost him something to produce. "To watch two men die in custody because I didn't plan properly. I'm asking you to sell me whatever you can spare at whatever price you set. I'll pay in county scrip if cash isn't available." The silence in the cabin ran for a long moment. The stove ticked. Outside, the wind moved through the frozen sage with a sound like paper being crumpled very slowly. "I don't want scrip," Wren said. "I don't want payment." She stood up. She crossed to the trapdoor, lifted the iron bar, opened it, descended the ladder. She was down there for perhaps 3 minutes. She came up with a canvas sack containing 12 pounds of potatoes, 4 pounds of dried beans, 2 pounds of smoked venison, a half pound of lard. She set it on the table in front of Pruitt. "That's a week for 2 men portioned correctly. Come back next week." Pruitt looked at the sack. He looked at her. His expression held something more than gratitude. It was the look of a man recalibrating his understanding of a situation he thought he understood. "Mrs. Calloway," he said and stopped. Started again. "When people were talking about you this summer, saying you'd gone strange with grief, I heard what they were saying. I didn't disagree with them." He said it without the evasion of someone who'd actually held a different private opinion. He said it as a plain fact about what he'd believed. "I thought you were a woman who'd had a very hard year doing something that looked a lot like not coping well." She met his eyes, held them. "Did you come here to apologize or to pick up the food?" And something close to a smile moved through his face quickly, because it was not a situation that had much room for smiling, but genuinely. "Both," he said. He picked up the sack. He put his hat back on. At the door he turned. "If you're willing, I'd like to send people to you who need direction. Not just food, I mean people who are running low and don't know what to do. You seem to know what to do." "Send them," she said. "I'll see what I can do." After he rode away, she stood at the window and watched the horse move carefully through the snow until it reached the road that connected the Basin Farms, and then she watched it go down that road until it was gone. She thought about what it meant that the first person to come to her had not been a family running out of food, but the legal authority of the county coming to account for a mistake in his own planning. She thought about how systems fail not all at once, not dramatically, but in the small sequential failures of individual decisions that had each seemed reasonable at the time they were made. She went to the ledger. She recorded the food given in the column she'd established for this purpose. She updated the total. The number on the wall needed to change. She changed it. The Henderson family came 4 days later. 6 children, the youngest 3 years old, the eldest 14, and their mother, Clara Henderson, who arrived at Wren's door with the 14-year-old carrying the youngest on his back because the child's boots had worn through and his feet were wrapped in burlap. Clara Henderson was a woman Wren's own age who had been a neighbor in the approximate sense that anyone in the basin was a neighbor, not close, not intimate, but known. She stood at Wren's door in the January cold, with 5 children arranged around her like a small fleet of damaged ships, and said nothing for a moment because there was in that moment nothing useful to say that the situation didn't already communicate. Wren let them in. She fed the children first hot broth from a venison bone cornbread she'd made that morning, a small portion of dried apples she'd soaked back to suppleness overnight. She watched the children eat with the focused attention of people for whom food had recently become something they thought about constantly, rather than something they consumed without reflection. The youngest fell asleep with a piece of cornbread still in his hand. She established the Henderson family in her ledger. She went over the numbers with Clara not to explain her system, but to make Clara understand the constraints within which the system operated. "I have enough to share," she said, "but not enough to waste. Every family that comes to me gets a specific portion. If the winter runs long, and it may run long, the portions may decrease. That's not a threat. It's a fact about how the arithmetic works." Clara Henderson looked at the north wall, at the number, at the other things pinned there, with the expression of someone encountering an intelligence they hadn't expected to find in a place they thought they understood. "How did you know?" she asked. "How did you know to do all this?" Wren thought about Bess's voice the first evening, at 20%, because you're not only counting for yourself. She thought about the last line in Voss's notebook. "Someone told me to plan for more than I thought I needed," she said. "I thought that was good advice." The Miller family came the week after the Hendersons, the Johnson family the week after that. Then 3 families she'd never met, settlers from the northern end of the basin who had heard through the Granger Falls informal communication network that the widow Calloway had food when no one else did. They came in 1s and 2s through February, arriving at her door in conditions that told their own story. Boots wrong for the depth of the snow coats, not heavy enough for the temperature they'd walked through. Faces carrying the specific hollowness that begins to appear when the body has been running a caloric deficit for several weeks. She let them all in. She fed them. She entered them in the ledger. By the 1st of February, she was supplying 11 families on a weekly rotation, in addition to the 2 men in the county jail. The ledger had become a document of some complexity, columns for names for portions distributed for what had been exchanged in return for the running total of what remained in the pit below. She maintained it with the same precision she'd applied to the construction of the pit itself, because imprecision in the ledger would translate to imprecision in the distribution, which would translate to someone going short before they should. No one received something for nothing. Those who had nothing to exchange contributed labor splitting wood, carrying water from the creek sections that hadn't frozen completely solid, patching the cabin's north-facing chinking where the cold was finding its way through. The ledger recorded all of it. It was not a charity register. It was a supply chain. The 14th of February was a Wednesday. Wren was at the table when she heard a sound unlike any that had come to her door before. Not the single horse of a rider, not the trudging footfall of a family on foot, but the rhythmic breathing of working dogs. She opened the door. Eugenia Hartwell was standing on the porch. She was not wearing the blue silk dress. She was wearing a wool coat sold by the Granger Falls General Store, serviceable, undistinguished, the coat of someone who had stopped maintaining standards that the situation could no longer support. The cameo brooch was gone. Her hair was pinned up without architecture, just contained. Behind her, the small sled she'd arrived on was pulled by 2 large dogs lying down in the snow, with the exhausted submission of animals that had been working at the edge of their capacity. In the curve of Eugenia's left arm, wrapped in a blanket and held with the specific tightness of a mother who has stopped pretending to be calm, was Adelaide, 7 years old, her face the gray-white of a child who has been cold for a long time. Wren stepped back from the door without speaking. Eugenia came in. She moved directly to the stove without being told and held. Adelaide close to it, unwrapping the outermost blanket layer, with hands that shook with the small involuntary tremor of someone who has been holding something tightly for too long. Wren got the kettle. She put milk on the second burner, milk she'd been rationing carefully from the single goat she'd acquired in November specifically for this kind of provision. She waited while Eugenia and Adelaide absorbed the heat of the cabin. She watched the color come back into Adelaide's face in increments. First a pink along the cheekbones, then warmth reaching the lips. Then the child's eyes opening fully and tracking the room with the slow reassembling attention of a person returning from somewhere difficult. After several minutes, Wren went to the north wall. She took down the list, Bess's list, the accounting of what people ate in Kansas in the final weeks of the snow winter of 1880 and 1881, worn soft at the folds from 3 months of hanging there. She carried it to the table, set it in front of Eugenia. Eugenia looked at it. She read it the way a person reads something they cannot stop reading, even when they want to, line by line, with the progression of an expression that moved through unease into something deeper and less manageable. When she finished reading, she kept her eyes on the page. "We're out of food," Eugenia said. Her voice had the roughened texture of someone for whom speech had recently required more effort than usual. "The supply wagons from Cheyenne haven't gotten through since December. The hunting parties we sent out in January came back with nothing. The deer have gone down below the snow line. Charles is—" She stopped. restarted from a different direction. My children are hungry, not uncomfortable. Hungry. She looked up from the list. Adelaide cried for 2 days when the food ran short. Then she stopped crying. That was worse than the crying. Wren sat down across the table. She looked at Eugenia Hartwell, who had come to her door in July in a silk dress and a carriage, and told her that civilization meant she didn't have to be afraid, who had ridden away with a smile that said clearly she believed what she'd said, who was sitting now at this table in a store-bought coat with her hands wrapped around a mug of warm milk and her daughter asleep in the chair by the stove. She thought about what it cost a person to make this trip. Not the physical cost, the other cost. The cost of arriving at the door of the woman you'd publicly called a grieving eccentric and asking her to open the floor of her cabin for you. Wren got up. She went to the center of the cabin floor. She lifted the iron bar, opened the trapdoor, descended the ladder. She was methodical in the dark. She knew the pit's inventory by position, now could locate specific items by feel and by the count of steps from the ladder's base. She came up with a canvas sack containing 15 pounds of potatoes, 6 pounds of dried venison, a jar of preserved pears, 3 pounds of dried beans, a half-pound of lard. She set it on the table. Eugenia looked at the sack, looked at Wren, looked at the open trapdoor still releasing its cold breath into the cabin air. Last July, Wren said, "You told me civilization meant you didn't have to dig holes in your floor." She let the silence hold for a moment, not cruelly, not as performance of vindication, but because the silence was the most accurate thing she could offer. The civilization that was going to protect you, the trains, the telegraphs, the Denver suppliers, where is it right now? Eugenia's hands tightened around the mug. She did not answer because the answer was visible in the way she'd arrived on a dog sled in a borrowed coat, carrying a child who had stopped crying because she'd run out of the energy crying required. "I'm not saying this to punish you," Wren said. "I'm saying it because you need to understand it before next winter, not after it." She pushed the sack across the table. "That's enough for 2 weeks for 3 children rationed correctly. I'll give you portioning instructions to take back. Come back in 2 weeks for the next allocation." Eugenia's hand went to the sack, stopped just short of it. "I mocked you in front of every woman in Granger Falls," she said. "I told people you'd gone strange with grief. I said it more than once to more than one person." "Your children didn't mock me," Wren said. "I don't hold them responsible for what you believed." She moved the sack the last inch across the table until it touched Eugenia's hand. "Take it. Come back in 2 weeks." The allocation to the Hartwell household changed the mathematics in the pit again. Wren went over the numbers that evening with the lamp turned high. 11 families plus Pruitt's jail allocation, plus the Hartwells, now 3 children, plus Eugenia herself, who was not eating enough. That hollowness in her face had a specific timeline to it, a timeline Wren recognized. She revised the weekly distribution downward across all households by 5%, a reduction she calculated would not cause harm in the short term, but would extend the supply by 11 days if the winter ran longer than projected. Then she did something she hadn't done yet. She found her own name in the distribution column, found the number representing her daily caloric allocation, wrote a smaller number next to it. She had been eating less than the standard allocation since the 1st of February, skipping the noon meal, reducing the evening portion, but she hadn't formalized it until now. Formalizing it meant committing to it. It was a constraint she was imposing on herself the same way she imposed constraints on the distribution system, not as punishment, but as logistics. The numbers had to work. She was one of the variables. The temperature in the last week of February dropped to -38. The snow that fell during this period was different from what had come before. Drier, finer, blown into shapes that suggested not accumulation, but sculpture, the wind doing something artistic and indifferent with the raw material the sky kept providing. She could see across the basin on the still days, the cold having compressed the air to a clarity that made distances look shortened, the mountains appearing close enough to touch. She could see the ridgeline above the Hartwell Range, the geometry of the Kingsley Ranch buildings against the white of the slopes above them. She could also see, when she looked east on clear mornings, the thin thread of smoke rising from Thomas Alder's farm, 6 miles distant. It rose at the same time every morning, regular as a clock signal, and it told her something she recorded mentally without writing down. Whoever was over there was still alive, still operating a stove on a schedule, still doing the things that living people do. She noted it each morning the way she noted the temperature and the depth of new snowfall. Data, evidence, the thin, cold fact that someone else in the basin had also prepared. The news from Cheyenne arrived in late February via a postal rider who made the run in conditions that should have prevented it. He delivered the mail at the general store and then sat by the store's stove for 3 hours before he could move his feet properly again. The copy of the Cheyenne newspaper he'd carried reached Wren through Pruitt, who folded it to the relevant page before sending it out with the weekly allocation rider. The headline was "Unambiguous Losses in Wyoming Territory Estimated at 75 to 80% of all cattle. Total financial damages in excess of $20 million." She read it twice. The number that stayed with her was not the financial figure, but the livestock figure. If 80% of the cattle in the territory were dead, then the economic structure that had brought most of the basin's wealthiest residents here, the structure Eugenia had pointed to as evidence of civilization's permanence, had been destroyed in 4 months by snow. On the first night of March, she opened the ledger and looked at the remaining total 160 kilograms. The number on the wall was 91 days. The calendar said it was March. In an ordinary winter, March meant the end was in sight. This winter had given no indication it was interested in being ordinary. She sat with the ledger open in front of her for a long time, not writing, just looking at the numbers. She did not allow herself to think about whether she'd made an error. Error analysis at this stage served no practical purpose. What she allowed herself to think was, this 91 days was enough if spring came on schedule. It was also exactly not enough if spring came late. She closed the ledger. She wrote on the wall below the number in smaller letters, March 1st, still here. Then she went to bed. March came in without apology and left without improvement. The days lengthened by the mathematics of the Earth's tilt, indifferent to what was happening on its surface, adding 4 minutes of light each day, as though the calendar were a promise the sky intended to keep regardless of the temperature beneath it. The thermometer held at -22 on the 1st of March, dropped to -28 on the 5th, climbed back to -15 by the 10th, then another front came down from the north on the 12th and pushed it back below -25, where it sat for 11 days like a fact that refused to be argued with. Wren reduced her own portion again on March 3rd. She did it in the ledger first, changed the number next to her name, calculated the downstream effect on the overall supply, confirmed the arithmetic before she committed to it, because doing it in the ledger first made it a decision rather than a sacrifice, which was an important distinction. Sacrifice implied suffering offered up for something. A decision implied a mind at work on a problem. She was not suffering for these families. She was solving for them. The solving was getting harder. She could feel it in the specific way that insufficient calories manifest in a body that is still working at full capacity. Not weakness exactly, not dramatic collapse, but a kind of thinning of the margin between effort and exhaustion. She would be splitting wood in the morning, moving through the task with her usual efficiency, and then at a certain point, not a dramatic point, not a wall, just a threshold. The next swing of the axe would cost more than the previous one in a way that couldn't be explained by simple fatigue. She noted it. She adjusted her work schedule to front-load the heavy tasks in the first hours after eating. She did not tell anyone. Aunt Bess knew. Bess had been sick since the middle of January, a chest cold that had settled in with the permanent quality of a tenant who has decided the arrangement suits them. She slept more than 12 hours a day now, which concerned Wren less as a symptom of illness than as a natural accommodation her 78-year-old body was making with a Wyoming winter that had exceeded any reasonable expectation of duration. She was warm, she was fed. But on a morning in the first week of March, when Wren came in from the woodpile and sat down at the table to eat the single bowl of porridge that constituted her morning meal, Bess was already awake in her corner, sitting up with her back against the wall, in the posture of someone who has been awake for some time, thinking about something specific. She watched Wren eat, her eyes cloudy at the edges, but still capable of focused attention, tracked the portion in the bowl, tracked the speed at which Wren ate it, tracked the moment Wren set the spoon down with food still remaining. "You're eating less than you're writing down," Bess said. Wren looked at her. "The allocation is accurate. The allocation is what you decided everyone gets. I'm talking about what you're actually eating." Bess's voice had the roughness of the chest cold, but the authority of someone who had been watching people make this particular mistake for 78 years. "I know what a woman looks like who's feeding everyone else first." Wren did not answer it immediately. The honest answer was yes, and the defensive answer was that it was logistically necessary, and the true answer contained both of those things in a proportion she wasn't prepared to discuss. She picked the spoon back up. She ate the remaining porridge. She met Bess's eyes across the cabin. "The numbers work if I adjust my portion," she said. "They don't work as well if I don't." "The numbers also don't work," Bess said, her voice carrying the flat precision of someone stating a physical law. "If you run your own body into the ground before the thaw." Wren recorded that conversation in the ledger that evening, not the words but the implication. She added a note next to her own allocation line: "Minimum floor, do not reduce further." She underlined it. It was the only line in the ledger she'd ever underlined. The next morning, without discussion, Bess began leaving half her breakfast portion on the table when she finished eating. She did it with the elaborate casualness of someone performing an unimportant action, pushing the bowl slightly to the side, settling back against the wall, closing her eyes as though she might sleep again. Wren looked at the bowl, looked at Bess. Bess's eyes were closed. Wren pulled the bowl toward her and finished it. Neither of them mentioned it. They did this every morning for the next 5 weeks, this small daily transaction conducted entirely in silence between two women who understood each other well enough that words would have been redundant. The news about Charles Hartwell came on the 4th of April, delivered by Roy Pruitt in person, because some information is not suited to the relay systems that ordinary news travels through. He came in the afternoon on horseback, moving at the careful pace that deep snow required. And when Wren opened the door, she saw from his expression not grief, not shock, but the settled gravity of a man who has had time to absorb something terrible and has decided how he will carry it, that he was not coming about the jail allocation. Charles Hartwell had walked out of Kingsley Ranch at 2 in the morning on April 2nd, in a wool shirt and trousers, without his coat, without his boots, wearing only the wool socks he'd had on when he sat at his desk reading the final telegram from the Chicago bank. They found him 400 meters from the house, face down in the snow, his hands at his sides. The telegram was still on his desk. It detailed in the flat language of institutional correspondence the full extent of what the bank intended to collect against the Hartwell cattle loans, the ranch buildings, the equipment, the remaining land holdings, everything that had a title attached to it. There was nothing in the telegram that constituted a surprise. Eugenia had known for weeks what was coming. But there is a difference between knowing a thing is coming and receiving the document that makes it official, that converts anticipated loss into legal fact. Wren listened to Pruitt tell her this. She stood at the window while he talked, looking out at the basin, at the white expanse between her cabin and the distant ridgeline where the Hartwell buildings were small dark shapes against the slope. She thought about Daniel standing at the door in February with his coat buttoned, telling her he'd be back before dark. She thought about the specific way a person decides in the face of an insurmountable fact that continuing forward requires more from them than they have left. She didn't judge Charles Hartwell for the decision he'd made. She understood the arithmetic of it, even if her own arithmetic had always come out differently. "The children," she asked. "Alive," Pruitt said. "Eugenia is functioning. She's keeping them together. But the bank's men will be in Granger Falls by May to start the inventory process, and she'll need to be out of the ranch house before the snow clears enough for them to travel." He turned his hat in his hands. "I thought you'd want to know before she comes to tell you herself." After he left, Wren sat at the table for 10 minutes without opening the ledger, without doing anything. Just sitting. This was unusual enough that Bess, watching from her corner, said nothing, recognizing the stillness as something that required its own space rather than company. Wren was thinking about the structure of things, about how the largest operation in the basin, the one that had employed hundreds of men, that had represented the culmination of 15 years of ambition applied to Wyoming land, had been reduced in one winter to a telegram on a desk and a man in the snow 400 meters from his own door. She was thinking about how the thing that had felt most permanent, the scale of the Hartwell enterprise, the infrastructure of wealth that Eugenia had pointed to as evidence that preparation was unnecessary, had turned out to be the most fragile because its foundations were living animals, dependent on grass they couldn't reach through 6 feet of snow. The small farms were still there. The people with root cellars were still there. The measure of a thing's permanence, she understood now, with the clarity of something proved rather than argued, had nothing to do with its size. She opened the ledger. She wrote the date April 4th in the margin. Then she went back to the day's numbers. The 12th of April was a Thursday. Wren woke before dawn to a quality of silence that was different from the silence of the previous 160 days, in a way she couldn't immediately quantify. She lay still in the dark, cataloging it. The wind was absent, the eaves were quiet for the first time in weeks. The stove had burned lower than usual overnight. She got up. She moved in the dark by memory across the cabin floor. Added wood waited for the fire to catch. In the corner, Bess's breathing was quiet. Too quiet, but not in an alarming way. In a way that Wren had been tracking for 2 weeks with the attention of someone who has been given enough information to recognize what the progression looks like. She lit the lamp. She carried it to the corner. Bess lay with her hands folded on her chest, her face smoothed by the absence of the small muscular efforts that consciousness requires. She had died sometime in the night quietly, in the way that people who have lived with a great deal of difficulty sometimes manage to die without drama, without the last-minute urgency that violent death brings, but with a kind of orderly completion, as though she'd simply finished what she'd come to do and set it down. Wren set the lamp on the small table beside the corner. She sat on the edge of the cot. She looked at Bess for a long time. She thought about the freight wagon in July, Bess climbing down with the driver's reluctant help, walking into the cabin and looking at the storage pit without saying anything for a long moment. She thought about the list written in a dead neighbor's block letters, folded soft at the creases, from years of being carried in a pocket or a bag passed from one pair of hands to another across the years as a kind of testament. She thought about the instruction Bess had given her that first evening, add 20%, because you're not only counting for yourself, which had turned out to be less about food than about the principle behind food, the understanding that preparation done correctly was never only for yourself. That was the thing Bess had known that the almanacs hadn't taught and the pamphlets hadn't covered. Not the technique of storage, but the ethics of it. Wren reached into her apron pocket. She took out the list. She'd been keeping it there since February, when she'd taken it down from the wall to show Eugenia carrying it as a kind of reference document, a reminder of what the alternative looked like. She unfolded it. She looked at the block letter handwriting of a woman who had died in a Kansas winter long enough ago that her name was no longer attached to the document that had survived her. She folded it again carefully along its original creases. She placed it between Bess's folded hands. "You don't need this anymore." Her voice low and the lamplit quiet. "You knew it by heart anyway." She sat with Bess for another hour. Then she got up, put the lamp back on, the table, went to the stove, made coffee, ate the morning's portion, recorded it in the ledger, and went out to begin the distribution rounds that 7 households were counting on that morning. She told no one about Bess until late afternoon, when the last family had come for their allocation and gone. She accepted the condolences of the people who came to her over the following days in the straightforward way. She accepted most things directly, without performing a grief she was still processing privately in the hours before dawn, when the cabin was quiet enough for internal work. The morning of April 19th was a Thursday, like the morning Bess had died, though Wren only realized this later. She woke at her usual hour before dawn, added wood to the stove, put the kettle on, opened the ledger to record the morning. The number on the wall read 28. 28 days of food remaining at current distribution levels. She wrote the date April 19th, 1887. She wrote the temperature, which she'd checked the night before, -4 Celsius. Cold, but not the killing cold of February. Cold the way late winter was supposed to be cold, the cold of a season in its final argument, rather than its prime. She put on her coat. She opened the cabin door. The light that came in was different. She noticed it before she processed it, a warmth in the quality of it, a directionality, the way light behaves when it comes from a sun that has fully cleared the horizon rather than struggling toward it. She stepped onto the porch. The air on her face carried something she hadn't felt since October, the faint suggestion of temperature as a gradient rather than a wall, the possibility that the air 12 inches above the snow was slightly less cold than the air at snow level. The snow had stopped. She understood this gradually rather than all at once, the way you understand something when the evidence has been accumulating without your awareness. The sky above the basin was clear, not the flat, pressurized gray of the past 5 months, but a blue that had depth to it that went back and back towards something true. The mountains to the west were visible for the first time since November, their peaks catching the early light in a way that made them look close. The basin stretched away from the cabin's porch in its white entirety, unmarked by new snowfall, holding the shapes the wind had made of it over the winter, in a stillness that was different from the stillness of cold. This was not the stillness of suppression. This was the stillness of something finished. She stood on the porch without counting the minutes. She looked at the basin, at the mountains, at the sky, at the long, level white surface that in 4 to 6 weeks would begin showing the dark earth beneath it. She was not a woman who marked moments with ceremony, but she was standing there and she was alive, and 167 days of Wyoming winter lay behind her like a road she had walked to its end, and she allowed herself to stand still on the porch of the cabin she had provisioned and maintained and operated as a supply depot for an entire community, and she allowed the morning to be what it was. Then she went inside. She opened the ledger. She wrote April 19th, 1887, day 167. Snow stopped. Remaining supply 31 kilograms. Estimated duration at current distribution 22 days. She set the pen down. She looked at the north wall, at the chalk number at the space where Bess's list had hung at Voss's notebook still pinned in its place. 3 sources of knowledge that had converged in this cabin to produce one outcome: enough. Not abundance, enough. Eugenia came in May on a day when the snow had retreated to the north-facing slopes, and the valley floor showed long patches of dark earth between the remaining drifts. She came on foot 8 kilometers in boots that were heavier and plainer than any she had owned in July. Her 3 children walked with her, Adelaide between her brothers, all of them moving with the recovered energy of people who had been eating properly again for several weeks. She sat at Wren's table without being offered the chair first, which was itself a change. The habit of waiting to be invited had belonged to a version of Eugenia Hartwell that the winter had retired. She placed a folded paper on the table between them. Wren didn't touch it. "It's the deed to 40 acres, Eugenia said. "The northeast parcel, the one that runs along your creek. The bank took everything with a cattle mortgage against it. This piece was in my name separately, a wedding gift from my father. They can't touch it." She looked at Wren directly with the eyes of a woman who had simplified considerably over the past 6 months, who had shed the various social mechanisms that wealth provides as insulation and arrived at something closer to her actual face. "It's the only thing of material value I have left. I want you to have it." Wren looked at the paper, looked at Eugenia, looked at Adelaide, who was sitting near the cold stove tracing the wood grain with her finger, with the focused abstraction of a child who has learned to entertain herself through long weeks of confinement. "Tell me what you're planning to do," Wren said. Eugenia's hands flattened on the table. "I don't know yet. I had thought Philadelphia, my sister, has room the children could go to proper schools. Everything here is gone. The ranch, the accounts, Charles." She stopped, restarted. "I thought Wyoming was a place you came to and built something, and then the something was permanent. I was wrong about that. What you built was permanent," Wren said. "What Charles borrowed against was living animals in an open winter. Those are 2 different things." She picked up the folded deed, turned it over in her hands. "Keep this for Adelaide. Keep it in her name. If Wyoming is ever the right place for her, she'll have somewhere to start." Eugenia's composure, which had held through this conversation with the steadiness of something genuinely rebuilt rather than merely maintained, opened then, not collapsed, but opened enough for what was underneath to be visible. Her eyes went bright. She looked at the ceiling of the cabin for a moment, then back at Wren, then at her own hands. "I asked you last winter how you knew," she said. "You told me you didn't know, you just couldn't afford to be wrong." She pressed her lips together. "I've been thinking about that since February. I built my life on the assumption that being wrong was something that happened to other people. People who hadn't planned as well, who didn't have the resources, who weren't as—" She stopped herself. "I never considered that my planning was the problem. That what I'd planned for and what could actually happen were so far apart that the gap itself was the danger." Wren looked at her for a long moment. Outside the window, the valley showed its patches of returning earth dark between the remaining snow, the beginning of the slow process by which winter gives back what it has taken. "The gap," Wren said, "is always bigger than you think. The only protection against it is building for the worst version, not the average version, because the average version will take care of itself. It's the worst version that requires your attention in July." Eugenia was quiet. "Then, will you teach me before I decide whether to go or stay? Will you show me what you did? I want to understand it properly. Not the idea of it. The actual work." Wren studied her across the table. The woman sitting here was not the woman who had descended from the lacquered carriage in July. That woman had arrived with her certainties organized around her like a structure load-bearing. This woman was carrying her certainties differently, looser held rather than leaned on available for inspection. It was not a comfortable way to carry things. It was the only way that left room for revision. "Come back Thursday," Wren said. "We'll start with the ledger." Thomas Alder appeared at the cabin in the second week of June without particular announcement, which was consistent with what Wren had observed of him across the years of being adjacent neighbors in the basin. He was a man who communicated primarily through presence and action, rather than through the social machinery of requests and formal approaches. He had a farm 6 kilometers to the east that he'd run alone since 1883, when his partner had gone back to Ohio, citing the difficulty of the winters. He had survived the Great Die-Up because he kept hogs rather than cattle hogs that could be confined, that could be fed from stored grain rather than from grass buried under impossible depths of snow. His storage pit was smaller than Wren's, but proportionally sufficient for a single man who had planned with the conservatism that comes from having been caught short once before in the winter of 1882, when he'd lost 2 fingers to frostbite on a supply run he shouldn't have needed to make. That loss had been his education. He had not required a second lesson. He showed up at her garden on a Tuesday morning, looked at what she was doing, picked up the hoe she'd set down to move a crate, began working the row next to the one she was working. They worked parallel to each other for 2 hours before he said anything. She noticed that he worked with his left hand leading on the hoe, the right hand's grip adjusted to accommodate the 2 missing fingers on that side, and that this accommodation was so thoroughly practiced, it had become invisible. She only saw it because she was paying attention, which was how most things worth knowing were seen. "You kept 11 families this winter," he said, not a question. 12 counting Pruitt's jail. He nodded, kept working. Another long silence, the kind that between 2 people engaged in physical work had its own natural quality, companionable, unpressured, the silence of people who understand that talk costs energy, the work also costs. "I had a surplus of 40 kilograms when the snow cleared," he said. "Didn't need it. Was alone so I could ration more aggressively than someone feeding children." He moved to the next row without changing pace. "If we'd combined supply chains in November, you could have given larger portions to the Henderson children. The youngest one was too thin." Wren stopped. She looked at him across the garden rows, this man she'd known in the peripheral way of basin neighbors, known enough to nod to not enough, to have had a conversation with that lasted longer than its transaction required. She looked at what he'd just said, not admiration, not reflection on what had been hard, an analysis of how a combined operation would have produced better outcomes delivered, as though they were still in November rather than June, as though the past winter were data to be processed rather than experience to be commemorated. "You couldn't have gotten to me in November," she said. "The road between your place and mine was under 4 feet of snow by the second week. I know, I'm talking about the winter of 1887 to 1888. He straightened, looked at the garden, at the cabin, at the configuration of the property, with the eye of someone calculating its integration with another. 2 operations combined: storage, shared distribution. The ledger would be more complex, but the supply margin would be twice as wide." Wren looked at him for a long moment. The morning light was coming in from the east, clean across the basin. The mountains were fully visible, their snowpack retreating, and the valley floor was green in the way that Wyoming valley floors are green in June. Not the deep green of somewhere with more rain, but the particular sage and grass green of a place that has made its peace with its own limitations. "Tell me what your root cellar looks like," she said. He told her. She asked specific questions: depth wall insulation method, average temperature, differential between the pit and the cabin floor, humidity management in late storage season. He answered each question with the precision of someone who had thought about these things carefully rather than intuiting his way through them. When she asked about the hog operation, he described the breed selection, the feed storage, the winter management protocols that kept the animals alive through temperatures that had killed cattle by the tens of thousands on ranges less than 20 kilometers away. She asked about his neighbor relationships, who he supplied, who he could rely on in return. The conversation lasted the rest of the morning, and through midday, moving from the garden to the porch, to the table inside, where she opened the ledger and showed him the full accounting of the winter intake distribution recipients. Portions, the running total that had gone from 481 in November to 31 on the morning of April 19th. He read it with the focused attention of someone who understands what they're looking at, not with admiration, but with professional respect, the way one craftsman examines the work of another and identifies both the technique and its limits. Your margin at the end was thin, he said. 22 days of spring hadn't come when it did. What would you have done? She had thought about this. She had thought about it in the last weeks of March when the numbers were running close enough that she'd been doing the calculation daily rather than weekly. Reduce portions further, she said. Started talking to Pruitt about whether there were options I hadn't identified. Kept the children's portions stable as long as possible before cutting them. She paused and started looking at the calendar very hard. He was quiet for a moment. Then what does your plan look like for next winter? She showed him the page in the back of the ledger where she'd already begun the new arithmetic. Starting inventory target 520 kilograms. Garden expansion into the north field. Second smokehouse to double the meat curing capacity. She talked through it the same way she'd talked through it in her own head, systematically without sentiment, as a problem of supply and demand applied to a specific set of constraints. He listened. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, looking at the numbers. If we combine the operations, he said, the target should be 900 kilograms minimum, enough to carry 20 households through an 8-month winter without anyone going short. He looked up from the ledger. I can contribute the hog operation 400 additional kilograms of storage capacity from my pit labor from June through October, half the distribution network cost. Wren looked at him across the table, at the ledger between them, at the numbers they'd both been running in their heads separately toward the same conclusion. We'd need to formalize the ledger structure, she said. Combined intake, separate household columns, shared running total. I can build a second ledger to mirror yours, cross-reference weekly. She nodded. There's one thing. He waited. I run the distribution ledger, both households combined, but I run the ledger. She looked at him directly without apology for what the directness cost. Not because I don't trust your arithmetic, because one person needs to hold the full picture, and I know this system. He looked at her for a long moment. His expression was not the expression of a man deciding whether to accept a condition imposed on him. It was the expression of a man recognizing a sound decision and confirming it. Agreed, he said. They worked until evening going through the planning for the summer's preparation. What to plant, what to buy, who in the basin should be approached about contributing to a more organized collective storage system, who among the families she'd fed through the winter had expressed interest in learning the methods rather than simply receiving their benefit. The list of the interested was longer than she'd expected. The winter had been an education available to anyone who'd paid attention, and it turned out that most people given sufficient motivation were capable of paying attention. Eugenia had been coming on Thursdays since the second week of May. She arrived each time with Adelaide, who had taken to the ledger work with an aptitude explained partly by her age 7, was young enough that the skill formed without the resistance adults brought to learning things that challenged their self-image, but mostly by something native in the child, a precision of mind that expressed itself in neat columns, accurate totals, the small satisfaction of numbers that resolve correctly. Wren taught them together, Eugenia learning the system, and Adelaide learning it faster, each proceeding at her own pace toward the same destination. Eugenia had not gone back to Philadelphia. This was a decision she announced on a Thursday in late May, with the matter-of-fact brevity of someone who has thought a thing through completely before speaking it. I'm staying, she said. The 40 acres Adelaide owns are worth working. There's a house on the northern edge of the Kingsley property that the bank didn't take because it was a separate structure from the main buildings. We'll live there. A pause. Charles would have wanted to go back. He always thought of this place as a project rather than a home. I don't have that problem anymore. She opened the ledger to that week's lesson without waiting for Wren's response, which was, Wren thought, evidence of the most important things she'd learned. On a Thursday in late June, Wren was at the north wall with a wet cloth wiping it clean. She erased the chalk number that had lived there since November, the number that had started at 241 and ended at 28 that she'd changed every morning for 167 consecutive mornings. She wiped until the wall was blank. She stepped back. She looked at the clean wall, at the empty space where Bess's list had hung at Voss's notebook, still pinned in its corner. She picked up the stub of chalk from the shelf. She looked at the clean surface for a moment, Then she wrote in letters smaller than she'd used for the numbers, but larger than she'd ever written on that wall before a single sentence, "Winter is coming. Be ready." She stepped back. Read it. It was not inspirational in the way that things written on walls for public consumption are inspirational. It was not uplifting or comforting or designed to make anyone feel that the future was manageable. It was a statement of the only thing she had ever been certain of. That winter came, that readiness was a choice, that the choice was made in summer with a shovel and a ledger, and enough respect for the coming cold to take it seriously before it arrived. Preparation was not the belief that everything would be fine. Preparation was the acknowledgement that it might not be, combined with the decision to do something about that fact before the fact arrived. She heard Thomas's wagon coming up the road from the east, the sound of a loaded wagon. He was bringing the first of the summer supplies from the Cheyenne freight that had come through Granger Falls that morning. She heard Adelaide's voice from the garden talking to Eugenia about the potato rows, asking something about spacing. She heard the Henderson boys on the creek below the north field, their voices carrying up in the particular way that boys' voices carry on a June afternoon when the air is dry and sound travels cleanly across open ground. The basin in late June was not what it had been in the railroad company photographs, not soft and golden in a light that implied ease. It was starker than that. The meadows between the remaining farms were empty, in a way they hadn't been in years. The cattle gone, the corrals silent, the infrastructure of the boom dispersed or collapsed. You could see the scars of the winter, the flattened fences, the roof lines that had buckled under accumulated snow, wait the fields that would need another season before they'd produce at their previous levels. The basin had not recovered. It was recovering, which was different, which was a process rather than a state. But the farms were there, the small ones, the ones with root cellars, the ones whose owners had listened to the kind of knowledge that doesn't come with credentials. The Hendersons were there, Clara working a garden twice the size of last year's. The Millers were there, the Johnsons, the families from the north end of the basin who had walked through blizzards to reach Wren's door and were now putting up their own storage pits with the urgency of people who had learned something they intended to keep. Thomas's wagon came to a stop at the edge of the garden. He climbed down and began untying the load without waiting to be asked. Wren went to help. The first supply bags were heavy potatoes, 50 pounds each, the early variety that would cure fastest before the larger shipments arrived in August. She took one end of the first bag. He took the other. Together they carried it across the threshold of the cabin, set it on the floor above the trapdoor, went back for the next. Below the trapdoor, the storage pit waited. Empty now, aired out its walls, checked for integrity, its sawdust insulation refreshed. It would not stay empty long. By October, it would be full again. By November, the chalk number would be back on the wall, starting high, decreasing daily, marking the distance between preparation made and spring earned. She knew this with the same certainty she knew the temperature differential between the pit and the surface, the caloric value of a pound of smoked venison, the number of days a person could run on reduced rations before the margins became dangerous. She knew it because preparation was not optimism. Preparation was not the belief that everything would be fine. Preparation was the acknowledgement that it might not be, combined with the decision to do something about that fact before the fact arrived. It was the most practical thing she knew how to do, which made it also the most humane. You built the pit so you could open it. You kept the ledgers so you knew what you had. You added 20% because you were never only counting for yourself. The sun was high, the mountains were clear. Somewhere in the sage below the north field, a meadowlark called with the extravagant, unnecessary beauty of a bird that has no idea what kind of winter is coming, that is singing now because it is June and the air is warm, and that is sufficient reason. Wren was already thinking about the numbers.